I want to begin with a very simple observation. For the past 50 years, and I want to reiterate 50 years, New Zealand built its trade policy on a very simple assumption. The world is becoming more stable. You're right. More predictable, definitely, and more integrated. That assumption shaped how we thought about reform. We made incremental changes, gradual improvements, and we had a lot of confidence that openness will deliver over time. That assumption no longer holds. What this symposium calls the polycrisis is not abstract in trade. It is the environment it operates in. Energy shocks, geopolitical conflicts, climate stress, and economic fragility is not separate issues. They reinforce one another, and they are reshaping how trade works. In that world, trade does not just move goods, it transfers shocks. So the question today is not whether trade matters, it clearly does. The question is what kind of trade, embedded in what kind of policy, makes a country more resilient in a very, very unstable world. For a small country like us, this matters more than it does for large economies. We are distant from markets, and that is not going to change. We are heavily dependent on shipping and imported energy, and we specialise in a very, very narrow export base. For the last 100 years, we have been exporting butter. We do not set global prices. We do not set supply chain rules or geopolitical outcomes. These are set elsewhere. That means that we are not just exposed to global shocks, we often feel them a lot earlier, more sharply, and with less barriers to protect us. What might be tolerable for or inefficient in a large, diversified economy can be very critical for a small one like us. I want to stress that resilience is not optional for New Zealand. It is a structural requirement. Modern trade systems were designed for efficiency. They rely on just-in-time supply chains, concentrated production, low-cost sourcing, and long distances and minimal redundancy. These systems work exceptionally well until they don't. Instability rarely arrives gradually. It might come as a tweet from Donald Trump, 2 o'clock in the morning. It tends to arrive very suddenly with cascading impact. And we can see that clearly currently in the Middle East. Disruptions of our shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor that has significant impact in terms of oil and gas and immediate consequences for our economy. The key point is this: trade systems transmit those impacts across borders. Distances does not insulate us from shock. In many cases, like I've said, it amplifies it. This brings me to a harder point. For roughly 50 years, successive New Zealand governments, and I'm reiterating this, successive New Zealand governments across the political spectrum have largely worked within the same economic frame. Policy has focused on improving efficiency. We have some fine-tuning, and we have expanded our openness in trade. That approach has delivered some benefits, but the long-run outcomes are more mixed than what we often acknowledge. New Zealand has avoided economic collapse, but it has not achieved sustained structural transformation. In relative terms, we have seen a gradual decline in our productivity rankings across the OECD, despite being one of the most trade-liberalised economies. This is not a story of inaction. It's a story of a policy that acted, but not at a scale and a depth sufficient to change our economic and social trajectory. We have signed a large number of free trade agreements over the past few decades. Great announceables for the government. These agreements have reduced tariffs and improved market access. It matters, but it's also clear that they've not fundamentally changed the structure of our economy. We continue to export, like I said, large amounts of butter, meat and logs to broadly very similar markets, with continued exposure to commodity cycles, shipping cost and external shocks. Nearly 40% of New Zealand's export earnings still come from a small group of primary commodities, particularly, like I said, dairy, meat and forestry. And those exports are not widely distributed. Over 70% go to a relatively small group of markets, with a single country accounting for around a quarter of that total exports. We all know what that is. Only 1% of our international trade volume does not go by sea. So in reality, 99.7% of our volume is moved via shipping. That makes our economy uniquely exposed to the disruptions in global logistics. Trade agreements have been necessary, but they have not been sufficient. And in an unstable world, that distinction becomes even more important. The recently signed free trade agreement with India illustrates this tension very, very well. India is strategically important to us. I agree with that, and the relationship matters. But a free trade agreement on its own will not transform New Zealand's economic pathway. We have tried this approach since 1980, and it has not been successful. I want to reiterate that trade agreements do not by themselves overcome distance. It doesn't take away where we are in the world. It does not build domestic capacity. It doesn't guarantee that our exporters would scale up. And it definitely doesn't insulate our economy against global energy and logistic shocks. Without parallel investments in skills, infrastructure, innovation, our environment, trade deals become symbolic success rather than a structural shift. Great photo opportunity. In an unstable world, symbolism is not good enough, and it should not be good enough for anyone in this room. There are, however, signs of a different approach that are emerging, and we've seen it in the last couple of months, and that is New Zealand's agreement with Singapore that guarantee the flow of essential goods such as fuel, food, medical supplies and construction materials during a crisis. This reflects a very different logic. This is not trade designed to maximise volume. This is trade designed to look at making sure that we have trust, that we have a backup capacity, and that we have a system stable and that can help us in times when conditions are deteriorating. The shift from optimisation to resilience is very, very important. So what does resilient trade actually mean in practice? At its core, it's about building a system that can absorb shock and continue functioning. So it means four things. The first, in plain English, it means not putting all our eggs in one basket. We have not been very successful in the last 100 years of diversifying that basket. We just don't sell to one market or rely on one supply chain. We need to spread that risk so when there are disruptions, it does not have such a significant impact on our economy. Second, it also means accepting that total efficiency is not always a good thing. Having some backup capacity, alternative suppliers, extra infrastructure that can look inefficient on paper, but it makes the system much more reliable in the world we're living in today. Third, it means recognising that physical constraints exist, energy costs, climate change, environmental limits shape what is feasible. Resilient systems work within those realities and within those constraints, rather than assuming that we will have endless cheap transport and unlimited resources. Fourth, it means building strong domestic foundations. When global shocks hit, economies with deeper skills, stronger industries, and greater processing capacity are better able to adapt. For New Zealand, these principles have very specific implications. First, diversification must be real, not symbolic. That means diversifying not just market, but also our transport routes, our energy inputs, and our ownership structures. Selling a wider range of products to the same few markets does not meaningfully reduce our risk. Second, we need to treat backup capacity as infrastructure, not waste. Strategic fuel reserves, alternative shipping arrangements, dual sourcing of critical inputs, and domestic processing capacity all look inefficient if you assume stability, but they are essential if you assume disruption. Third, trade policy must be coupled with domestic capability. A small country does not become resilient by signing more agreements. It does so by building skills, manufacturing depth, meaning less outsourcing, more in terms of processing capacity and innovation in our own ecosystem. Those conditions are important. Fourth, we should prioritise relationships that are dependable under stress. Trusted partners, crisis response agreements, and regional compacts that guarantee continuous and of essential goods matter more than marginal tariff gains in volatile times. Finally, a resilient trade must support regional and community stability. When a shock hits, they affect places, people, communities, not abstractions. Trade that increases exposure without strengthening local capacity risks weakening our social and economic resilience over time. The core issue ultimately is whether we are prepared to move beyond policy tinkering in a world that is no longer stable enough for this to work. For a long time, the key question in trade policy has been, does this improve our efficiency? In an unstable world, the more important question should be, does this improve our ability to cope, to adapt, and to protect our economy and our society when things go wrong? For New Zealand, that requires moving beyond a narrow focus on trade liberalisation alone. Efficiency and access on their own will not deliver resilience, security, or long-term prosperity for us. Trade will remain essential, but the form it takes must change. The real choice is no longer openness versus retreat. It is fragile integration versus resilient connections. And for a small, exposed economy in a very, very volatile world, that is not a theoretical question. It is a very practical one about how we design our system and our policies and our future. Because if we understand the reality we are operating in, we still have choices, but only if we act on them. Thank you.